She had been lifting, hauling, and bleeding for the Jebb family since she was 9 years old, and in all that time not a single soul in Dustfall Ridge had looked at her like she was worth saving. She was simply there the way a fence post is there, or a stone wall useful until it cracks. But on one gray Tuesday morning a stranger rode into town with haunted eyes and a ramrod spine, and he did something no one in this dying place had done in longer than memory. He looked at Harriet Lou Dawson, and he stopped. What happened next would not only shatter the chains of her bondage, but forge something neither of them ever expected, something stronger than iron, more stubborn than drought, and more enduring than the red clay beneath their feet. Stay with this story until the very end. The town of Dustfall Ridge had a way of swallowing people whole. It did not do this dramatically the way a flood swallows a valley or a fire consumes a field. It did it slowly, patiently, the way the desert does everything by degrees of erosion so gradual that the thing being worn down hardly notices until the day it realizes it has been reduced to almost nothing. The buildings along the main street leaned into one another like exhausted men at the end of a long shift, their paint long since surrendered to the sun, their planks gone silver gray and cracked with age. The general store had a window with a crack running diagonally from corner to corner that nobody had ever repaired, because the people of Dustfall Ridge had long ago made a quiet collective peace with broken things. The livery smelled of old straw and resignation. The saloon, ironically, was the most lively establishment in town, and even it only managed a kind of desperate brittle energy on Friday nights before collapsing back into dusty silence by Sunday morning. The land around it was no more merciful than the town itself. The ridge that gave the place its name was a low, ragged spine of red rock running east to west along the northern edge of town, and on dry afternoons when the wind blew right, it would kick up a fine red powder that settled on everything, and everyone coating lips and lashes, and leaving the whole world tasting faintly of iron. In summer, the heat was absolute. In winter, the cold was the kind that had no interest in your survival. The land grew scrub and cactus and the occasional stunted juniper, but it grew poverty with particular abundance, and the people who remained in Dustfall Ridge after the silver played out were the ones who either could not leave or had forgotten how. Harriet Lou Dawson was one of the ones who could not leave. She was 26 years old, though she looked older in the way that hard labor ages a person, not in terms of lines or gray hair, but in the careful, measured economy of her movements, the way she never wasted an ounce of energy, the way her eyes were always calculating distances and weights and the surest path between 2 points. She was a powerfully built woman, broad-shouldered and deep-chested, with strong, capable hands that had long since lost any softness they might once have had. Her dark hair was kept in a single practical braid that she wound up under her hat when she worked, which was always. Her face was square-jawed and serious, with dark eyes that took in a great deal and gave back very little. She was not a woman who smiled easily, and this was not a character flaw, but a reasonable response to a life that had given her very few occasions for it. The debt that bound her to the Jebb family was a thing of paperwork and childhood, and legal fine print that she had not been old enough to understand when it was first explained to her. Her mother had died when Harriet was 7, leaving behind nothing but a small bundle of IOUs signed over to Calvert Jebb, the patriarch of the Jebb family and the closest thing Dustfall Ridge had to a man of business. The debt was not large in dollar terms, but Calvert Jebb had a gift for interest, the kind that grew in the dark like a fungus. And by the time Harriet was 9 and her mother 2 years in the ground, the debt had grown large enough to require, in Calvert's legal and civic opinion, the indenture of the surviving dependent. A judge 2 counties over had agreed or had been persuaded to agree, and so Harriet had gone to work in the Jebb household, and the debt had continued to grow regardless of how many years she gave them, because that was the nature of the instrument Calvert had drawn up, and he was very careful about his instruments. Calvert Jebb was dead now. His son Silas Jebb was not an improvement. Silas was a lean, sun-darkened man of 40 with a mustache he kept oiled and a temper he did not. He had inherited his father's ledgers and his father's legal strategies and something else, something his father had at least kept better concealed, a casual, almost bored cruelty that he exercised without guilt or relish, the way another man might crack his knuckles. He did not hate Harriet specifically. He simply did not think about her as a person in any meaningful way. And this indifference was in some respects more damaging than hatred would have been, because hatred at least requires acknowledgement. Harriet's days followed a pattern as inflexible as the seasons. She rose before light. She hauled water from the well behind the Jebb property to the house, to the barn, to the troughs. She chopped the wood that heated the house and fed the cook stove. She mucked stalls, repaired fences, loaded and unloaded the supply wagon that made its weekly run to the trading post 12 miles east. She did the work of 2 hired men, and she did it on 1 hired hand's rations, and she slept in a narrow room off the back of the barn that was adequately warm in summer and barely survivable in winter. She had learned over the years not to think too far ahead. Thinking too far ahead led to a particular kind of despair that was not useful, and Harriet was above all things a practical woman. She thought instead about the task immediately in front of her, the weight of the axe, the angle of the cut, the most efficient way to stack the cords so they stayed dry. She thought about the small dignities she could maintain, the cleanliness of her work, the precision of the fence line, the fact that the water troughs she filled were always full when she left them. These things mattered to her, not because anyone noticed them, but because she noticed them, and in a life with very few things to claim as her own, the quality of her work was one of them. It was on a Tuesday in late October that everything changed, though Harriet would not fully understand the magnitude of the change until some hours after it began. The morning had started badly. The supply wagon's rear left wheel had developed a loose spoke, a thing that Harriet had noticed and mentioned to Silas Jebb twice in the past week. He had not had it repaired because having it repaired cost money, and telling Harriet to deal with it cost nothing. She had done her best to brace it with a strip of rawhide, but rawhide and a loose spoke are no match for 12 miles of rutted trail, and somewhere between the 3rd and 4th mile on the return from the trading post, the wheel failed spectacularly. The wagon lurched, the load shifted, and the near horse, a nervous gray mare who startled at her own shadow on a good day, came completely undone. She screamed and plunged and kicked until she had managed to tangle herself thoroughly in the traces and tip the remaining portion of the wagon sideways into the ditch at the edge of the main street, spilling 2 months' worth of supply crates into the red mud. It took Harriet 20 minutes to calm the horse, untangle the traces, and get the animal back onto solid ground without further injury to herself or the mare. By the time she had done this, her boots were filled with mud, her braid had come half loose, and her left hand was bleeding from a scrape, where a trace buckle had caught her. She was kneeling in the mud, methodically repacking the spilled crates, when Silas Jebb appeared. He had come from the saloon where he had apparently been for some portion of the morning. This was evident from his mood, which was the particular kind of mean that sits in a man when he has been drinking steadily enough to remove his better judgment, but not steadily enough to slow him down. He looked at the wagon, at the mud, at the spilled supplies. Then he looked at Harriet. She knew what was coming. She had seen this particular expression on his face before. She set down the crate she was holding and stood up slowly, turning to face him because she had long ago decided that she would not be struck from behind. The main street of Dustfall Ridge was not empty. There were people on the boardwalk in front of the general store. A woman in a blue dress who had stepped out of the milliner's and then stopped 2 older men seated on a bench in front of the barber shop. They watched with the particular stillness of people who have witnessed this kind of scene before and have learned that getting involved costs more than they are willing to pay. What happened next was brutal and swift and in full view of everyone. Silas struck Harriet across the face with an open hand, a blow hard enough to snap her head sideways. Then he grabbed the front of her work coat and shook her, his voice a low, grinding thing telling her what this had cost him, what she had cost him, what she was, and what she would spend the rest of her life paying for. She did not cry out. She did not fight back. She stood in the mud and took it with her jaw set and her eyes fixed on some middle distance, because she had learned that fighting back made it longer and harder, and she had work still to do today. The second blow sent her to one knee. She was still kneeling, one hand braced in the mud, when she heard a sound she did not at first understand. It was the creak of saddle leather and the deliberate, unhurried sound of boots on the boardwalk, and then a voice she had never heard before said quietly and absolutely, "That is enough." She looked up. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was a stranger. He had arrived in Dustfall Ridge sometime that morning, apparently because Harriet knew everyone in town, and she did not know him. He was perhaps 35, lean through the jaw, and broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair pushed back under a hat that had seen considerable weather. His eyes were a light clear gray, the kind of eyes that would have looked at home in a younger, less burdened face. They were, at this moment, very calm and very fixed on Silas Jebb. He had descended from the boardwalk and was walking across the mud of the street toward them with a measured, unhurried stride that somehow communicated more authority than any amount of speed would have. Silas turned. "Mind your own business, stranger." "I just did," the man said. He had come to a stop perhaps 6 feet away. His hands were loose at his sides. "Step away from her." Silas Jebb was not a coward. He was mean, and he was accustomed to going unchallenged in Dustfall Ridge, which in his mind amounted to the same thing. He stepped forward. What happened in the next 4 seconds was very fast, and left Silas sitting in the mud with the stranger's hand clamped around his wrist, and his arm bent at an angle that nature had not intended, and the stranger crouching over him with those gray eyes very level and his voice very quiet, saying something that Harriet could not quite hear. Then he let Silas go and stepped back. Silas got to his feet. He was breathing hard, and his eyes were the color of something burning. He looked at the stranger, then at Harriet, then at the small audience that had gathered on the boardwalk, all of them very still and very attentive now. "You made a bad decision," Silas said. "Likely not my first," the stranger replied, and turned away. He walked back across the mud to where Harriet was still kneeling. He did not offer her a hand up, which she appreciated, because she did not need one. He simply crouched to her level and looked at her face where it was beginning to swell with the frank clinical assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating damage. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I will be," she said. It was the honest answer, and he seemed to understand that because he simply nodded once and stood back up and retrieved his horse from the hitching post and rode out of the main street without another word. Harriet watched him go. Then she went back to repacking the supply crates. But something had shifted in her, something small and bright and dangerous, like a coal that had been banked for years and had just been given a breath of air. She packed the crates with the same steady efficiency as always. She righted the wagon and secured the load and drove the nervous gray mare back to the Jebb property and unloaded everything and completed the remainder of her assigned work before the sun went down, because she was a woman who completed her work. But her mind all afternoon was somewhere else. It was in Silas Jebb's private office, where he kept his ledger. Harriet had cleaned that office every week for 11 years. She knew where every piece of furniture stood and where every drawer was, and she knew because she was an observant woman who paid attention to everything that the ledger Silas kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk was not a business ledger in any ordinary sense. She had seen its pages on 2 occasions when Silas had left the drawer unlocked, and she had cleaned quickly and carefully enough to read several entries before hearing him return. The entries were in Silas's cramped hand, and they documented transactions of various kinds, not all of them legal, not all of them voluntary, and several of them involving officers of the law in neighboring counties. That ledger was the kind of document that in the right hands could ruin a man. She had never touched it because there had never been a use for it. There had never been anywhere to run. But now there was a stranger in Dustfall Ridge who was setting up a ranch somewhere at the edge of town, and he was looking for a resilient partner, and Harriet Lou Dawson had been resilient her entire life. She did not deliberate long. Deliberation was a luxury of people who had options, and her options were narrowing by the day. She was practical. She was purposeful. She moved. Just past midnight, when the Jebb household was fully dark, and Silas was snoring with the profundity of a man who had drunk himself horizontal, Harriet rose from her cot in the back room of the barn fully dressed. She had gone to bed that way because she was not a woman who left things to chance. She moved through the dark as she had always moved through the dark, without hesitation and without noise, and she went to the back window of Silas's office and used the flat of a knife blade to slip the simple latch she had noticed years ago was slightly misaligned with its housing. She had the ledger in her hands in under 3 minutes. She replaced the office window exactly as she had found it and walked out into the cold October night with the ledger tucked under her arm and her jaw still swollen and a calm, absolute certainty in her chest that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember like the future. The stranger had made camp on the eastern edge of town at the base of the ridge, a reasonable and experienced choice that put the rock face at his back and gave him a clear line of sight in 3 directions. She found him by the low glow of a banked fire that he was apparently keeping small by design, and she appreciated that about him before she had even spoken to him, because it told her he was careful. He heard her coming. She knew he did because she saw him shift before he saw her, and his hand moved and then went still when he registered that it was a single figure approaching without stealth. "Miss," he said when she stepped into the firelight. "I need to speak with you," she said. "All right." He did not tell her to sit down, which was also correct, because it was not his place to offer her a seat in the open air. He simply waited. She looked at him for a moment. In the firelight, he looked older than he had in the street older, in the way that certain kinds of experience age a person, the same way she was older than her years. His eyes were patient and watchful, and she thought she recognized something in them, though she could not yet name it. She put the ledger on the flat of a nearby rock where he could see it, and told him in plain language what it was and what it contained. She told him about the debt, and about the Jebb family, and about the kind of man Silas Jebb was, and the kind of connections he maintained. She told him that if she simply ran, Silas would have the law on her inside a week, and the law in 3 of the 4 surrounding counties was in that ledger. The stranger listened without interrupting. This was one of the most useful things a person could do, and he did it well. When she had finished, she said, "I heard in town that you purchased the Alderman plot, 20 acres on the south edge." 32, he said, "deeded this morning." "It is dry land," she said, "rocky. It will take years of labor to make it productive." "I know that." "I can do that labor," she said. She held his gaze directly because she had decided some years ago that she would not look away from a man she was speaking to seriously. "I have spent 11 years doing work that would have broken a hired hand in 6 months. I can dig and haul and build and tend animals, and I can do it without complaint and without requiring instruction after the first time I am shown a thing." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped softly. "What are you asking for?" he said. "A legal arrangement," she said. "The kind that Silas Jebb and no county sheriff can touch." She did not allow herself to be embarrassed by what she was about to say, because embarrassment was also a luxury she could not afford. "They will chase a runaway indefinitely, but they cannot touch a veteran's legal wife. She paused. Marry me. In return, I will give you every hour of my labor to build your ranch. This ledger stays with me as insurance. If either of us ever has reason to need it, we have it. The stranger looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the ledger. Then he looked back at her. My name is Ethan Cole Maddox, he said. I know, she said. I heard it in town. And yours is Harriet. Harriet Lou Dawson. Another silence. The wind off the ridge moved through the dry grass around the fire and carried with it the cold mineral smell of rock and dust. I want to be honest with you, Ethan Maddox said, and his voice had shifted slightly, become more direct the way a voice does when a man is setting aside any courtliness he might have been performing. I am not a man built for partnership, Miss Dawson. I have spent 3 years trying to find something that a quiet piece of land might give me, and it has not gone well. I am not easy company. I am not looking for easy company, she said. I am looking for a legal name and honest work. He studied her face in the firelight, the swelling along her jaw, the absolute steadiness of her expression, the complete absence of pleading in her eyes, and she knew he was reading her the way she had read him, not for weaknesses, but for the substance of what was actually there. All right, he said. The word was simple and without ceremony, and that was exactly right. Harriet Lou Dawson did not need ceremony. She needed a door, and he had opened one. She held out her hand, and Ethan Maddox shook it, and that was the beginning of it. The marriage was performed the following morning at the county clerk's office by a notary public named Herbert Finch, who smelled of pipe tobacco and asked no questions beyond what was legally required, for which Harriet was quietly grateful. Ethan wore his cleanest shirt. Harriet wore her one dress, a dark green wool that she had owned for 4 years and kept in reasonable repair. They signed the papers and shook Herbert Finch's hand and walked out into the October sunlight as husband and wife, which was a fact of legal record and almost nothing else, and both of them understood that perfectly. Silas Jebb discovered the missing ledger that same afternoon. Harriet received word of this second-hand through the woman who ran the milliner's shop, who had always been kind to her in the quiet way of people who can only afford small kindnesses. Harriet received the information without visible reaction and filed it away. Silas could not go to the law because the law was in the ledger, and going anywhere near a courtroom would require him to explain in some detail why he was so interested in recovering it. He was furious. He was also, for the first time in Harriet's memory, helpless, and this was a sensation she felt in her chest, like warm water. That afternoon she gathered her belongings. They were not many. A change of work clothes, the green wool dress her mother's Bible, which was the only thing of her mother's. She possessed a bone-handled jackknife, a tin cup, a small watercolor portrait of the Sierra Nevada mountains that she had found blowing across the street when she was 12, and kept because it showed her something she had not yet seen and wanted to. She packed these things into a flour sack and carried them out of the barnroom without looking back. The Maddox property was 4 miles from town, and they covered it in the wagon Ethan had hired, sitting side by side in a silence that was not comfortable or uncomfortable, but simply honest. The land came into view in the late afternoon light, and Harriet looked at it steadily. It was, as she had said, difficult land. The soil was thin and rocky, sitting over a base of dense red sandstone that would resist a pickaxe and laugh at a spade. The previous owner, a man named Alderman, who had given up and moved to his sister's house in New Mexico, had made several attempts at plowing that were still visible in the scraped and furrowed surface, all of them aborted at different stages of failure. There was a cabin small and low with a solid stone foundation, but a roof that needed significant attention. There was a barn in acceptable condition, a smokehouse that had partially collapsed, a well that would need to be dug deeper, and about 40 yards of wooden rail fence that was listing at an angle that suggested it was holding itself up largely out of habit. Ethan stopped the wagon, and they both looked at it for a moment. "It is not much," he said. "It is more than I have had," she said, and got down from the wagon with her flour sack and walked toward the cabin. She did not allow herself the indulgence of standing in the doorway and imagining what it might become. She walked in, assessed what was actually there, and immediately began noting in the systematic way of someone who has always had to make her own plans what needed to be done first. The roof was the priority. The water situation was second. Everything else could wait. She set her flour sack on the cleanest corner of the floor, took off her coat, and went back outside to begin. Ethan watched her from the wagon for a moment before climbing down himself and going to see about the horses. Neither of them had any idea in that late October afternoon what was going to grow out of this thin and rocky soil. But the work had begun, and for both of them in their different ways, that was the only place they knew how to start. The first morning on the Maddox property began before sunrise, the way all of Harriet's mornings had begun for as long as she could remember. Though this time the darkness she woke into was different. It was her own darkness. The ceiling above her cot was her own ceiling, cracked and in need of repair, but hers. The cold that pressed against the single window was the same cold as always, the same October bite, with the same mineral sharpness off the ridge, but it pressed against her window now, not Silas Jebb's. She lay still for exactly 1 minute, which was the closest she ever came to luxury, and then she rose. Ethan had slept in the barn. This had been his decision, and she had not questioned it, because the arrangement was what it was, and neither of them had any illusions about it. He had said the previous evening, after they had eaten a sparse supper of salt pork and hardtack that neither of them had commented on, that he would take the barn until they could put together something more suitable. Harriet had said that was reasonable. He had banked the fire in the cabin stove and gone out into the dark, and that had been the end of their first evening as legally married persons. She had the stove going and water heating before the sky had even begun to consider lightening. She made a thorough second inspection of the cabin in the growing warmth, checking joints and floorboards, pressing her palm against the interior wall logs to feel for gaps where cold air was moving, cataloging every crack and deficiency with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who was already building a repair schedule in her mind. The cabin was structurally sound, which was the most important thing. Everything else was labor, and labor was the one currency Harriet had always possessed in abundance. Ethan came in from the barn when the sky had gone from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn. He moved quietly, which she had already noticed about him, not the careful quietness of someone trying not to disturb others, but the habitual quietness of someone who had learned that noise could cost you. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had made and stood by the window and drank it, looking out at the dark property. "I am going to start on the roof today," Harriet said. She was not asking. She was informing because the roof was the priority, and the priority did not require debate. "I was thinking the well," he said. "The roof first," she said. "A dry interior is the foundation of everything else. We can collect water from the creek for now. A leaking roof in winter costs us more than a long walk to the creek." He looked at her. She met his gaze with her habitual directness. "All right," he said. It was the same word he had said the night she had found him at his camp, and it had the same quality, neither reluctant nor enthusiastic, just a plain acknowledgment that her reasoning was sound. She appreciated that about him, too. She spent that first day on the roof, which meant she spent it on a ladder with a hammer and a pry bar, pulling damaged shingles and assessing the substrate beneath, and then making the several-mile trip with the wagon to the nearest lumber yard to purchase replacement materials, and then returning and beginning the actual work in the thin afternoon light that remained. Ethan spent the day on the fence line, pulling the listing rails and resetting the posts with a methodical patience that she could see from the roof, and that told her something about the kind of worker he was. They did not talk much that day. There was not much occasion for it, and neither of them was a person who talked for the sake of filling silence. In the evening they ate together again, beans this time that Harriet had put on in the morning, and Ethan contributed a small portion of dried venison from his pack, and the meal was better than the night before, which was a modest but genuine improvement. "You know what you are doing," he said, meaning the roof not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, the kind that a person makes when they are updating their understanding of a situation. "I have repaired every structure on the Jebb property at one time or another," she said. "Not because I was asked to, but because things that are not repaired become things that collapse, and collapsing things create more work." He turned his tin cup in his hands. "How long were you there?" 11 years. He was quiet for a moment in the way she was coming to recognize the way he went quiet when he was processing something that sat uncomfortably against his sense of how the world ought to work. "That is a long time," he said. "It is." She agreed and left it there because there was nothing more useful to add. He did not press. She appreciated that most of all. The days that followed established a rhythm between them that was not discussed and did not need to be. They rose before light, worked through the day with brief interruptions for food and water, and came together at the end of the evening for a meal that grew incrementally better as Harriet organized the kitchen and Ethan occasionally produced things from his stores that she had not expected. He had coffee beans, real ones, not the chicory approximation that Dustfall Ridge generally made do with, and on the third morning when the smell hit her, she looked at the pot on the stove for a moment before looking at him, and he was watching her with something that might on a warmer face have been called amusement. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "I have a friend in a supply town 4 days east," he said. "He sends them when he can." She poured herself a cup and held it in both hands and stood by the window, drinking it in the gray, pre-dawn light. And for a moment something unknotted very slightly in her chest, something small and tight that had been there so long she had forgotten it was not simply part of her. She said nothing, but he saw it. The roof was finished by the end of the first week. The fence along the eastern boundary was in good repair by the middle of the second. Harriet began on the irrigation trenches in the third week, which was the most brutal work yet, because the topsoil was thin, and what lay beneath it was the dense red sandstone bedrock she had anticipated, and the only way through it was patience and a heavy pickaxe, and the willingness to do the same thing for many hours in a row. She worked with a rhythmic, unwavering persistence that she had developed years ago as a kind of survival mechanism. The steady crack and chunk of the pickaxe against rock, the shovel scraping the broken pieces aside, the methodical advance of the trench, inch by inch, through the day, these were things she could control completely, and there was a deep and private satisfaction in that. A satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone watching, and everything to do with the fact of the work itself. Ethan watched her. Not in a way that felt like surveillance, but in the way that a person watches something that genuinely interests them, something that requires a revision of previously held assumptions. He was working nearby on the collapsed smokehouse, rebuilding it from the stone foundation up, and periodically she would be aware of him standing still for a moment with a stone in his hands, looking in her direction, and then returning to his work. On the 12th day he said without preamble, "You do not need to prove anything." Barnabas in the trench up to her knees, swinging the pickaxe in a long, even arc. She paused and looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I mean to say," he said, and stopped, and seemed to reassemble whatever he had intended to say into something more accurate. "I mean that you have already earned your place here. You do not need to work like you are still trying to justify your existence." She looked at him for a moment. The wind off the ridge moved through the dry scrub grass around them. "I am not justifying my existence," she said. "I am building an irrigation system. They are different things." She put the pickaxe back to work. He stood there a moment longer, and then went back to his stone wall, but she thought she heard something from his direction that might under other circumstances have been a quiet sound of surprised appreciation. It was at the end of the third week that she began to understand something about Ethan Maddox that she had been observing without yet fully articulating. He was a man of considerable practical competence, which she had established quickly. He knew animals and land and tools and the basic engineering of rural structures, and he worked with a steadiness that matched her own in its refusal to be hurried. But there were moments, particularly in the evenings, and particularly when the wind was up and the shadows moved in certain ways across the cabin walls, when something changed in him. He would go very still, not the comfortable stillness of a man resting, but the rigid, locked stillness of something bracing for impact. His eyes would go to a different distance than the one in front of him. His hands would tighten on whatever he was holding. She did not ask him about it. A woman who had spent 11 years learning to read the interior weather of an unpredictable man knew the difference between the kind of darkness that wanted to be asked about and the kind that needed to be left alone. And this was the second kind clearly, and she respected it, the way she respected every boundary that was honestly presented. But she filed it away because she was a woman who kept careful records of the things that mattered. The first social interaction with the town of Dustfall Ridge as Harriet Maddox, rather than Harriet the Jebb family's indenture, came at the end of the fourth week when they drove the wagon in together for supplies. She had braced for it without allowing herself to show that she had braced for it, because she was not certain how the town would receive this particular development, and she had learned not to expect kindness from uncertain situations. What she had not anticipated was the silence, not the hostile silence she had known her entire life in that town, but a different kind. A recalibrating silence, the silence of people who were revising their category for her and had not yet landed on a new one. The woman from the milliner's, the one who had given her the small kindness of information about Silas's discovery, smiled at her with a warmth that was genuine and unguarded. Herbert Finch, the notary public, tipped his hat. Two of the men from the livery looked at Ethan with the particular assessing look that men give to other men they are trying to place in the local hierarchy, found what they were looking for in his level gray eyes, and looked away. Silas Jebb was not in evidence. She heard through the natural telegraph of a small town that he had gone to a lawyer in the county seat to inquire about options, and that the lawyer had apparently discouraged him from pursuing the matter, which told her the lawyer was smart enough to have heard about the ledger, or connected enough to know who was in it. Either way, the silence from the Jebb direction was the best news she had received in years. On the drive back to the property, the wagon loaded with supplies, including another small bag of the good coffee beans that she had added to the list without comment, and that Ethan had paid for. Without comment, she sat beside him in the afternoon light and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not happiness exactly, because happiness was too large and too fragile a word for what she experienced. It was something more like the absence of dread, a negative space that had been so consistently filled for so long that its emptiness had its own distinct quality, like the silence after a sound that has been going on for years finally stops. They rode in that absence for a while. "I want to show you something," Ethan said when they were about a mile from the property. He turned the wagon slightly off the track, following a faint line through the scrub that she had not noticed before, and they came around the base of a low rock formation to a place where the land dipped into a shallow basin. And in the basin, sheltered from the prevailing wind by the curve of the rock, there was a different quality of soil, deeper and darker than anything on the rest of the property, and a seep of moisture along the eastern edge where some underground source was finding its way to the surface. "I found it the second day," he said, "before you arrived. I have not said anything because I was not sure what it was yet." She got down from the wagon and walked into the basin, crouching to take a handful of the dark soil and feel it between her fingers. Rich, dense, the kind of soil that held water and gave it back slowly. She walked to the seep and crouched again and touched the damp surface and brought her fingers to her nose. "Sweet water," she said. "Underground spring, probably. Deep." She stood up and looked at the basin, at its dimensions, at the sheltered curve of the rock above it. Ethan. She used his name without planning to. This is where the well should go. He was watching her from the edge of the basin. I thought the same thing. She looked at him. In the late afternoon light, with the low sun hitting the red rock behind him and the wind moving through the scrub grass, he looked for a moment less guarded than she had yet seen him. Not open. He was a long way from open, but less locked, the way a door looks when it is still closed, but the bolt has been drawn back. She looked back at the basin and began calculating quietly and systematically what it would take to realize what she could see here. The well, the irrigation from the spring seep, the deep soil properly cultivated, the shelter of the rock for cold season growth. It was not going to happen quickly. Nothing on this land was going to happen quickly, but it was going to happen, and she could see the shape of it now, the way she had once seen the shape of a completed fence from a pile of rails and posts, and the seeing of it was its own kind of fuel. "We should get back," she said. "There is still light left." "There is," he agreed. They drove back to the cabin in the fading afternoon, and there was something between them on that wagon seat that had not been there on the way out, something neither of them would have known how to name, and neither of them tried to, which was exactly right. Some things needed to be left to grow in their own time and at their own pace, because forcing them before they were ready only broke them. That evening, Harriet sat by the cabin stove after supper and took out her mother's Bible not to read from it, but because she sometimes held it when she needed to think the worn leather of it a familiar weight in her hands. She sat and looked at the fire through the iron grate and thought about the basin and the dark soil and the underground spring and the shape of things to come. Ethan was at the table cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention he gave to all his tools, and the cabin was quiet except for the fire and the wind outside, and the small sounds of the work they were each doing. And it occurred to Harriet Lou Maddox, sitting in her own cabin, with her own fire and her mother's Bible in her hands, that this was a thing she had not experienced before, and had not known to want, and that its presence in her life was going to require some careful tending. She was a practical woman. She knew how to tend things. The well broke ground on the first Monday of November, and Harriet swung the opening pickaxe blows herself. She had mapped the dig site over 3 days prior, walking the basin in the early mornings with a forked willow branch that she did not put particular faith in as a divining instrument, but used as a focusing tool, a way of slowing herself down and reading the surface of the land with more attention than she would give it, walking at normal pace. The moisture seep along the eastern edge of the basin had been her true instrument, and the soil samples she had taken at various depths her true data. And by the end of those 3 mornings she had marked a spot 6 feet from the seep with a stake of white-stripped juniper that she was as confident about as she was about anything in this uncertain business. Ethan had dug wells before. This was one of the things they discovered about each other in those early weeks. Not through extended conversation, but through the gradual exchange of competencies that happens when 2 people are working hard toward the same ends and begin to learn each other's professional languages. He had ranched before the war in a different state on his family's land, and he knew the work of it the way Harriet knew the work of indentured labor from the inside out without romanticism. He brought his knowledge to the well dig without fanfare. and without trying to redirect what she had planned. And what emerged was a genuinely collaborative effort. Her reading of the land married to his experience with shoring and lining, and by the end of the first week they had a shaft 12 feet down and the walls properly braced, and at 13 feet the earth turned dark and wet around the bit of the auger, and Harriet climbed down the rope ladder and pressed her palm against the wall and felt the cold seep of it against her skin and called up to him. "It is here," she said. His face appeared at the circle of light above her, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked down at her in the shaft, with the good dark water coming in around her hand. "All right," he said. And she heard something in it that she had not heard before, a quieter register, something that was not quite relief, but was in the same territory. They lined the well and built the housing over the following 4 days, and on the morning they lowered the first bucket and drew it up full of cold, clear water. Harriet tasted it standing at the rim of the well with Ethan beside her, and it was exactly what the soil had promised. Sweet and mineral clean and very cold. She handed the dipper to Ethan, and he drank and handed it back, and they stood there in the thin November sun without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and the moment was complete without words. November deepened, and the work deepened with it. The days shortened, and the cold sharpened, and the ranch began incrementally, and with great effort, to take on the quality of a place that intended to exist. The smokehouse was rebuilt. The barn roof was reinforced against winter snow load. Harriet dug the first section of the main irrigation channel from the spring seep to what she had designated on a rough map she kept pinned above the cabin table as the primary kitchen garden plot. The ground was brutal. The pickaxe rang against rock for long stretches, and the vibration traveled up her arms and into her shoulders, and she worked through it the way she worked through everything, by moving her attention fully into the immediate task and letting the discomfort exist at the edge of her awareness where it could not stop her. Ethan one afternoon stopped working on the section of channel he was extending and stood watching her work for a moment. She was aware of him watching and continued at her pace. "Harriet," he said. She completed the blow she was mid-swing on and looked at him. "How long can you do that?" he said. He was not challenging her. He was genuinely asking. "As long as it needs doing," she said, and went back to work. He was quiet for another moment and then said, "Your grip is off on the left hand. You are letting the handle rotate when it hits the rock. It is costing you energy." She stopped. She looked at her hands. He was right. She had noticed a fatigue in her left wrist that she had attributed to the hardness of the rock, but his observation was more precise than that. "Show me," she said. He came and took the pickaxe and demonstrated the adjustment in grip, the slight rotation of the wrist before impact that kept the handle from torquing. She watched his hands carefully, because she watched everything carefully, and then she took the axe back and tried it. The difference was immediate and significant. She did not thank him with words. She simply incorporated the correction and kept working, which was the most genuine form of acknowledgement she knew, and he seemed to understand that, because he went back to his section of the channel without waiting for anything further. These were the moments that built something between them. Not the large moments, not the dramatic ones, but the small and practical ones. The correction of a grip, the sharing of a dipper of water, the way he began leaving the coffee pot on the stove longer in the mornings, because he had noticed she sometimes came in later than him when she had been working the far fence line, and she had said nothing about wanting warm coffee, but it was the kind of thing that a person notices if they are paying attention. She noticed that he was paying attention, and this was not a small thing to a woman who had spent 11 years being essentially invisible. She was paying attention too. And what she was accumulating in her careful internal ledger was a portrait of a man at war with himself in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what he had carried home from a place he did not speak of. She saw it in the way he positioned himself in the cabin, always with his back to a solid wall and a line of sight to the door. She saw it in the way he came alert at sudden sounds, his whole body organizing itself for a threat before his mind could intervene and tell him there was none. She saw it in the evenings most clearly, when the fire burned low and the wind found its voice in the eaves and the shadows moved on the walls, and Ethan would go to that other place, the one behind his eyes that she could not follow him to, and had the sense not to try. She was not afraid of it. She had grown up around a different kind of damage and had learned very early to read the particular landscape of a person's interior wounds. What she felt sitting across the cabin from him in those moments was something closer to recognition, and something closer still to a careful watching patience. The night it broke open was in the 3rd week of November. A hard wind had been building since afternoon, the kind that came off the ridge carrying cold and a low, continuous sound that was more felt than heard, and by evening it was pressing against the cabin walls with enough force to make the lantern flame lean sideways even with the windows shuttered. Harriet had gone to bed at her usual hour, aware of the wind and the way it was affecting the quality of quiet in the cabin, but she was a woman accustomed to sleeping in imperfect conditions, and she had managed. She did not know what hour it was when the sound woke her. It was not a large sound. That was what made her attend to it so carefully, because it was the sound of something being suppressed, a sharp bitten-off noise from the direction of the main room, and then the sound of furniture moving, not falling, but moving, being displaced by the motion of a person who did not know where they were. She was on her feet, and at the doorway of her room in seconds, standing in the opening, with her hand on the frame, looking into the main room. Ethan was standing in the center of it. He had knocked the table sideways. One of the chairs was overturned. He was not fully awake, or rather, he was awake, but not here, not in the cabin, not in Dustfall Ridge, not in November. His eyes were open, and his body was rigid with a terror that was absolutely real to him and absolutely invisible to her, and his breathing was the fast, shallow breathing of a man in acute danger. She had seen this before, not in a soldier, but in a draft horse that had been beaten badly before it came to her, a huge gray animal named Conductor that would come apart in harness at a particular quality of sound and be gone behind his eyes to whatever had been done to him unreachable by ordinary means. She had learned with Conductor that the worst thing you could do was touch him in that state, and the second worst thing was to speak to him in the soft, cautious voice that people used with frightened animals, because that voice said, "Danger is real, I am trying to manage you," and it kept the fear alive. What had worked with Conductor was authority, not aggression, not force, but the clean, grounding signal of a calm, dominant presence that communicated without any room for ambiguity, that the world was ordered and she was in it, and so was he, and the danger was not here. She did not think about this. She simply did what she knew. She did not move toward him. She squared her shoulders and planted her feet, and took a breath and let her voice come out at its lowest, most level register, the one that had no pleading in it and no alarm, only certainty. "Ethan." He did not respond, but his breathing changed slightly, some fractional shift in the pattern of it. She turned and took the axe from the hook beside the door, the hatchet they kept there for kindling, and she crossed the distance to where she was 5 feet from him and stopped, and she set the axe head on the floor between them deliberately, the wooden handle upright. "Ethan, you are in Dustfall Ridge." Her voice was flat and steady and real. "You are in your cabin. Smell the pine smoke. It is November. You are in your cabin." She paused 1 beat. "Pick up the axe. There is a cord of wood outside the south wall. Go chop it. Now." For 3 seconds nothing happened, and she held herself completely still, not reaching for him, not softening her voice, just being present with the absolute certainty of someone who knew where she was and expected him to find his way to the same place. Then his eyes changed. Not fully, not all at once, But the focus in them shifted, moved from whatever was behind his eyes toward what was in front of them, toward the axe handle, standing upright between them and her broad, steady presence behind it. He bent and picked up the axe. She stepped back and held the door open, and he went out into the cold November dark. She could hear him out there, the hard rhythmic crack of the axe, each blow landing clean and full, the sound traveling through the cold air with a clarity that the wind which had dropped somewhat did not diminish. She built the fire up from its coals and put water on to heat, and sat at the righted table and waited, and the chopping went on for a long time longer than any reasonable cord of wood required, and she let it go on because it was not really about the wood. When it stopped, there was a silence, and then the door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment. His shirt was dark with cold sweat despite the temperature. His hands, both of them wrapped around the axe handle, were shaking with the fine, rapid tremor of exhausted muscles, and his face was the face of a man who has just been somewhere terrible and found his way back by a path he does not fully understand. She stood up without speaking and filled the dipper with the water from the pot, warm now, but not hot, and crossed to him and held it out. He took it with both hands and drank. When he lowered the dipper, his eyes found hers, and what was in them was something she recognized from the inside, the particular rawness of a person who has had their most private damage witnessed by another human being without their consent, and does not yet know what to do with that. She took the dipper back. She said, "Sit down," in the same level tone, not gentle, and not hard, just matter of fact, the tone of someone managing a practical situation. He sat. She poured him coffee from the pot she had made while he was outside and set it in front of him, and then sat across from him and waited, because she knew how to wait. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at the table. He said nothing for a long time, and she filled the silence with her own solid presence, not crowding him with it just being there, the way the cabin walls were, there, providing the fact of enclosure without demanding anything. "I do not usually," he started and stopped. "I know," she said, "you should not have had to see that." She looked at him. "I have seen worse outcomes from untended things," she said. "At least you were chopping wood and not burning the cabin down." He looked up at her, startled, and something moved across his face that was entirely unexpected, that dissolved some portion of the raw shame in his expression into something that was almost not quite, but almost a sound of disbelief at finding any lightness in this moment. "That is not something most people would say," he said. "I am not most people," she said. "No." He agreed quietly. "You are not." They sat with their coffee until the fire had built the room back to warmth, and he did not tell her what he had seen behind his eyes, and she did not ask, and the not asking was its own form of respect that she could see him registering. What changed after that night was not dramatic and not immediate. It was gradual and structural, the way good construction happens, foundation first, then framing, then the slower work of finishing. Ethan began in the days that followed to exist in a slightly larger version of himself within the space of the cabin and the ranch. He talked more, not at length, and not about the deep things, but about the practical ones. The land, the animals, the plans, and the talking had a different quality than it had before, less monitored, less careful about each word before it was released. He began teaching her to shoot. This happened without preamble. He simply appeared one morning with the Winchester and 2 of the older rifles and a supply of cartridges and told her he was going to show her how to care for a firearm properly and how to fire it with accuracy, and she received this information in the same spirit in which it was delivered as a practical matter between people who lived on isolated land and needed to be capable. She was a quick study. She had always been a quick study with physical skills because she paid close attention and her body was strong and her hands were steady. The first time she put 3 rounds into a tight group at 40 yards with the Winchester, Ethan lowered his own rifle and looked at the target, and then looked at her. "You have done this before," he said. "No," she said, "but I know how to swing an axe." In return, and without it being discussed as an exchange, she began including him in the work with the horses. The Maddox property had acquired 2 working horses, and Ethan had purchased a pair of young mustangs from a man in town who had caught them off the range and lacked the patience and skill to bring them along. They were beautiful and terrified and dangerous in the way that terrified, beautiful things are, and Harriet had a method with them that she had developed entirely on her own over years of working with the Jebb family's damaged animals. She spent time simply being in their space, not approaching, not handling, just occupying the same air, going about other tasks in the corral, letting them habituate to her weight and her smell and the particular rhythm of her movement. Ethan watched this from the fence rail the first time and the second, and on the third day he climbed over the rail and stood at the far end of the corral and went about a task of his own, following her lead without being told to, and she saw one of the young mustangs orient toward him with its ears forward rather than flat, which was significant. "Stay where you are," she said quietly. "Do not look at her directly. Let her come to the idea of you." He stilled. He looked at the fence post in front of him. The mustang took 2 steps in his direction and stopped. "You are good at this," he said very quietly, not moving. "Animals and damaged things," she said also quietly. "They respond the same way. You have to let them know. The danger is not coming from you." He was quiet for a moment. The mustang took another step. "Is that what you were doing?" he said carefully, that night. She considered her answer with the same care she gave everything. "Yes," she said. Another silence. The mustang was close enough now that he could have touched her if he reached out, which he did not. He held completely still. "It worked," he said. "Most things do," she said, "if you read them right and give them time." It was an evening in mid-December, and the sky outside gone the deep blue-black of serious winter, the fire in the stove burning strong, and the cabin warm and smelling of wood smoke and the venison stew Harriet had made when Ethan looked up from the harness he was mending and looked at her across the cabin in the lamplight, and she happened to look up from the rough survey map she had been annotating at the same moment, and their eyes met with the simple directness of people who have stopped pretending they are not looking. He set down the harness. He reached across the table and picked up her right hand and held it, not squeezing, not stroking, just holding it in both of his with the same deliberate steadiness he brought to everything. And he looked at her hand, at the broad palm and the strong fingers and the skin roughened and scarred by 11 years of labor, and then by weeks of pickaxe and fence post and rifle barrel, and then he looked up at her. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said. There was no performance in it. It was a simple, factual statement delivered with the same honesty he brought to everything. And perhaps because it was so plainly, unmistakably sincere, it went through all of Harriet's defenses the way that simple things sometimes do not, through force, but through the gaps that are too small for large things to enter. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked at their hands together on the table, his weathered and scarred, in their own different ways, hers broad and rough and capable. She had spent a very long time being ashamed of her hands, of her size and her strength, and the blunt, formidable physical fact of her all the things that the world had told her made her less than the narrow, delicate version of womanhood that it preferred. She had built those things into weapons and tools and buried the shame under the practical necessity of using them, but it had been there, it had always been there. A low and steady ache of unworthiness that she had never told anyone about, because there had never been anyone to tell. She looked at Ethan's face. He was not saying it to be kind. He was not saying it to make her feel better. He was saying it because it was true, and he was a man who said things that were true. The ache did not disappear. It was too old and too deep for one moment to dissolve it. But it cracked in the way that bedrock cracks under sustained pressure, not all at once, but along a line, a fissure that let in something it had not let in before. She turned her hand in his and held it back. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge and down through the scrub and pressed against the cabin walls and found no way in. The stove burned. The lamp burned. Two scarred and careful people sat across a table from each other in the deep of winter and held on, which was the most honest thing either of them had done in a very long time. Winter passed. The way hard things pass, not quickly, not gently, but completely, leaving behind evidence of itself in the fence posts that needed resetting. After the freeze, thaw cycles worked the ground in the roof shingles that required inspection after the weight of snow, in the particular exhaustion that lives in a body that has worked through cold for months without rest. But it passed, and when the first genuine warmth came to the Maddox property in early March, it came to a place that was measurably different from the one that had entered winter 4 months before. The well-produced water of a consistency and volume that justified every hour Harriet had spent calculating its placement. The irrigation channel extended through December and into January during the brief windows of workable ground now reached 3 distinct planting areas in the basin, and the dark soil there had been turned and amended through the winter months with everything Harriet could source. Composted manure from the barn ash from the stove, the decomposed organic matter she had identified at the base of the rock formation and carted by the barrowful. The smokehouse stood solid. The barn was weather-tight. The 2 young Mustangs, Harriet's persistent and unhurried project through the coldest months, now accepted saddle and bridle with the calm, if not entirely enthusiastic cooperation of animals that have been properly persuaded rather than broken. And the 2 people who had built all of this together had become, over the course of those months, something that neither of them had a precise word for, but both of them recognized in the way you recognize a change in weather, not by being told about it, but by what you feel against your skin. They did not speak of it directly. This was not evasion. It was the natural caution of people who have both been badly hurt by the collapse of things they needed, and who understood without discussing it that what was growing between them was too significant to rush and too new to survive being pressed before it was ready. What they did instead was continue to show up fully and without reservation in every practical and daily way that their life together required, and allow the accumulation of those showings up to mean what it meant. Ethan had not had another night terror since November. This was not because they were over, and both of them knew it, but because he had begun cautiously and on his own terms to do something about them. He had found in the county seat a physician who had treated men returning from the war and who did not tell him that what he experienced was a weakness of character, which was what the first 2 physicians he had tried had done. This one, a quiet German-trained doctor named Hauser, had explained things to him in practical terms that Ethan could work with, that the body remembers what the mind cannot process, that the work is to give the body other memories to reach for. He had come home from that appointment and told Harriet about it the same evening, sitting at the table after supper, not with the halting discomfort of confession, but with the straightforward manner of a man reporting useful information. She had listened in her usual way fully and without interrupting, and when he finished, she said, "That is consistent with what works with the horses." He had looked at her for a moment and then nodded, as if she had confirmed a calculation he had been working through. "Yes," he said, "I thought the same thing." Spring planting began in earnest in April, and it was the most demanding sustained effort they had yet undertaken, because it required coordination of every resource they had simultaneously. The seeds had been ordered through the winter with great care, Harriet having spent considerable time researching what would grow in thin-soiled, high desert conditions, what would tolerate rocky ground, what could be relied upon for food versus what might eventually become marketable. She had written letters to an agricultural office in the state capital and received back a package of printed materials that she had read with the thoroughness she gave all sources of useful information. Ethan had connections from his pre-war ranching years with a man who could supply them with a small starter herd of cattle at a price that was not comfortable but was survivable. They were not prosperous. They were not close to prosperous. But they were building something with the quality of permanence. And both of them felt this in the way the body feels a change in elevation, a subtle shift in pressure that alters how deeply you breathe. It was at the end of April that the first signs of the drought appeared, and Harriet noticed them before anyone else in the county did, because she was watching the land with the particular attention of someone who has staked everything on it. The seep along the eastern wall of the basin thinned first. She measured it by habit, a notched stick she kept at the edge of the moisture line, and in the last week of April, the water line dropped the width of 3 fingers below the notch she had cut for the previous week. This was not necessarily alarming in isolation. Spring was variable, but she watched the sky and the sky was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in the way of visible storm or obvious absence, but wrong in the way that a face is wrong when the person wearing it is concealing something. The clouds that built in the west each afternoon and should have brought the early season rains moved through without dropping anything of consequence. The wind had a dryness to it that was more characteristic of July than April. The soil at the surface of the unirrigated sections of the property had developed a particular fine-cracked texture that she had seen before and did not like. She brought it to Ethan on a Wednesday evening without alarm in her voice, because alarm was not useful until you knew what you were alarmed about, and what she had now was data, not certainty. "The seep is dropping." She said. She showed him the notched stick, the marks she had made each week. "The rains have not come. The surface soil is cracking at the pattern, and speed I would expect from a dry summer, but it is April." He looked at the stick. He looked at the marks. He understood what she was showing in him because he had ranched before, and he had seen drought, and he was not a man who needed information softened before he could receive it. "How long do we have," he said, "if this continues?" "On our current water allocation with the well and the reduced seep, I can sustain the kitchen garden and the livestock through July," she said. "If the seep continues to drop at this rate, I will need to recalculate in June." "And the range cattle?" "The range will go first," she said. "We have no control over that. What we can control is the basin." He was quiet, looking at the map she had spread on the table, the one with her careful annotations marking water sources, soil quality gradations, the irrigation channels in their branching pattern from the spring seep to the planted areas. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to deepen the well by at least 6 feet before the summer hits," she said. "And I need to build a cistern to capture and store whatever rain does fall instead of letting it run off the rock." He looked at her. "That is several weeks of hard work." "Yes," she said. "Then we should start tomorrow," he said, and reached past her to mark the map with the pencil she kept beside it. They started the next morning. Deepening the well was the more dangerous of the 2 projects because it required one person to be lowered into the shaft while the other managed the rope and the windlass above, and the work at the bottom was cramped and dark and required the removal of material in small loads hauled up bucket by bucket. They alternated this, each taking turns in the shaft, and the trust that this required was the most complete and unambiguous form of trust. There is the kind where another person literally holds your life in their hands, and you have no way to verify the security of the arrangement except by the evidence of their character, which you either believe in or you do not. Harriet believed in Ethan's character with the same thoroughness with which she believed in the structural integrity of a well-set fence post, based on direct observation and tested experience. And she knew from the way he managed the rope and the windlass, from the care he gave to every knot and every signal call, that he extended her the same belief in return. The well went down 4 more feet before they hit a deeper aquifer better than they had hoped, and the water that came up from it was colder and cleaner than what they had been drawing. The cistern took another 2 weeks, built from the flat sandstone slabs that the property offered in abundance, mortared with a mixture Harriet had researched through the winter and sealed with a pine pitch compound that Ethan knew from his ranching years. When it was finished, it could hold 2 weeks of supplemental water supply, and they had built it at the highest point of the basin's natural drainage so that every drop of rain that fell on the surrounding rock face would funnel toward it. They stood back and looked at it on the afternoon it was completed, both of them dirty and tired in the bone-deep way of people who have done significant physical work over an extended period, and the sky above them was blue and absolute and completely without clouds. May came and delivered almost nothing. The rains that should have come with it came as a spattering of isolated showers that darkened the rock for an hour and left the soil essentially unchanged. The range grasses that the cattle depended on stopped growing and began to go brown at the tips, which was a July phenomenon appearing in May, and the cattle on the open range that several families in the area kept began to drift toward water sources with an urgency that told Harriet everything she needed to know about the state of those sources. She and Ethan began seeing evidence of the broader crisis on their supply runs to Dustfall Ridge. The town had a particular texture when things were going badly, the same way it always had a brittleness in the way people moved and spoke, a shortness in transactions that were normally social occasions, a gathering of men at the corners who were not talking so much as standing in shared proximity to their collective anxiety. The water level in the town's shared well, she heard at the general store, had dropped significantly in the past 2 weeks. The creek that fed it, never a robust source, had narrowed to something that could be stepped across. She and Ethan drove home from that supply run in a silence that was heavier than their usual silence, because the information it contained was heavier. "They know about our well," Ethan said when they were a mile from the property. "They have known since we dug it," she said. "Dustfall Ridge does not keep secrets well. When their water fails completely," he said carefully, "they will come here." "Yes," she said. Another mile of silence. The dry scrub moved in the hot wind on either side of the road. The horses moved with the slightly subdued energy of animals that are conserving themselves in heat. "We cannot sustain the whole town," he said. "No," she said. "But we might be able to sustain the most vulnerable of it if we are disciplined about rationing." She paused. "That is a problem for when it arrives. What concerns me more right now is what comes with it." He glanced at her. "Desperation," she said simply, "is not always a thing that knocks politely on the door." He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the road. "No," he said, "it is not." June arrived and fulfilled every dark promise that May had made. The seep in the basin reduced itself to a thin trickle, and then on a Tuesday in the second week of June stopped entirely. Harriet stood at the wall of the basin, where the moisture had once seeped through the rock face, and pressed her palm against the dry stone, and felt the absence of it with a physical clarity that was almost like hearing a sound cut off. She left her hand there for a moment. Then she took it away and went to find Ethan. "The seep is gone," she said. He set down what he was doing and looked at her. "The well and the cistern," she said. "That is what we have." "How long?" "At current consumption with strict rationing through September," she said. "If the rains come by August, we survive. If they do not come until October, we are in a very difficult position." She paused. "The livestock numbers need to come down. We cannot water them all through a long drought. I have worked out which animals are the priority." He listened to the list she had prepared, the ranking of livestock by their value to the survival of the operation, the cattle that would need to be sold or slaughtered first, the horses that were non-negotiable, the reasoning behind each decision. He did not argue with any of it, because the reasoning was sound, and he knew it, and because he was a man who did not argue with sound reasoning out of pride. "You have been working on this for a while," he said when she finished. "Since April," she said, "when the seep first dropped." He looked at her. "You did not tell me then." "I did not have enough data in April to bring you a plan," she said. "I brought you the concern in April. I have brought you the plan now." She met his eyes directly. "I do not bring problems without solutions, if I can help it." He held her gaze, and in his was something that she was learning to recognize, and still each time she saw it felt like an unexpected gift, the look of a person who sees you completely and finds what they see worthy of everything they can give. The real deterioration of Dustfall Ridge happened in the last week of June, fast and ugly, the way deterioration happens when a thing has been holding on for a long time and the last support gives way. The town well dropped to mud. The creek was gone. The livestock losses across the county were catastrophic, and the human losses in terms of collapsed livelihoods and burned-through reserves were beginning to show on every face in every establishment in town. Harriet saw it on their last supply run of the month, the gauntness that is not just hunger, but the gauntness of people who have stopped being able to imagine improvement. She came home from that run and told Ethan what she had seen, and they sat at the table together and spoke for the first time with complete openness about what was coming and how they would meet it. "They will come in groups, Yemen," she said, "probably within the week, possibly sooner if someone talks in the saloon about where the water is." "Jeb will be in that group," Ethan said. His voice was level, but she knew what it cost him to say it levelly. "Yes," she said, "and Jeb has never forgiven either of us, and he has enough history with this town that he can move people who might otherwise be reasonable." She looked at the table. She looked at the map with its careful annotations. The well marked the cistern, marked the channels in their branching pattern. "We cannot give them everything, but we cannot refuse them everything either, not with children in that town." "No," he said immediately, "not with children." "Then we need to be ready to control the terms," she said. "Because if we let the terms be set by a desperate mob, we lose everything, including the ability to help anyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. "I need you to trust me," she said. "When the moment comes, whatever I do, trust me." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes that she had come to know as well as she knew the grain of the wood in the cabin floor, and he said, without hesitation, without qualification, "Always." Outside the cabin, the July heat was building in the east, and the sky above Dustfall Ridge was the hard, merciless blue of a season that had decided not to relent. And somewhere in town, a man named Silas Jebb was sitting in a dry saloon talking to thirsty, frightened, angry people. And the shape of what was coming was as visible to Harriet as a storm front on a clear horizon, and she was the kind of woman who did not wait for the storm to make her plans. She got up from the table and began preparing. They came on a Thursday evening, which Harriet had predicted within 2 days of accuracy because she understood how desperation moved through a small town the way she understood how water moved through rock, finding the path of least resistance and accelerating as it went. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses and boots and wagon wheels on the dry road carried in the still July air with the particular clarity that extreme heat lends to sound. And she was already standing on the porch when the first torches appeared at the edge of the property, their orange light jumping and wavering against the darkening sky in a way that was not dramatic so much as deeply wrong fire in a drought being one of the most primal signals of danger that the human nervous system knows. She counted them as they came into the range of the porch lantern. 19, 20, 23. Men mostly, a few women, at the back of the group, several of them carrying the hollow-eyed look of people who had passed through fear into the flat country on the other side of it, where decisions become very simple and very dangerous. She recognized most of the faces. She had grown up among these people. She had hauled water for their livestock and repaired their fences when Silas had hired her out for extra coin, and she knew which of them were fundamentally decent and which were fundamentally otherwise. And she knew that desperation had a way of temporarily reassigning people from one category to the other. Silas Jebb was at the front of the group, which she had also predicted. He had not led them there out of any genuine concern for the community. He had led them there because this was his best and possibly last opportunity to reclaim something he had lost. Not just the ledger and not just the legal leverage it represented, but the version of Dustfall Ridge in which Harriet Lou Dawson was a piece of property and he was the man who owned it. That world was gone, and she knew it, and some part of him knew it too. But desperation, as she had told Ethan, was not a thing that accepted facts graciously. Ethan was inside. She had told him to stay there until she called for him, and she had told him why, and he had listened and agreed, because he was a man who understood that the best person to lead a particular engagement was not always the person with the most firepower, and because he trusted her absolutely as he had promised. She stood on the porch with her arms at her sides and her weight evenly distributed on both feet, and she waited until the group had come to a ragged stop in the yard in front of the cabin. The torchlight made everything orange and unsteady, and she was conscious of the well behind the cabin and the cistern beyond it, and the basin with its carefully tended garden, all of it sitting in the dark behind her, all of it. The product of months of the hardest work two people had ever done together, all of it, now the thing these people had come for. Silas stopped 10 feet from the porch steps. He looked different from the last time she had faced him in a public way, the time in the muddy street that felt like it belonged to a different chapter of someone else's life. He was thinner, and the drought had taken the remaining ease from his face and left something rawer underneath. But his eyes had the same quality she had always known in them, the quality of a man who has decided in advance what the outcome of a situation will be, and is simply going through the motions of arriving at it. "We have come for the water," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The 23 people behind him were the volume. "I know why you have come," Harriet said. "Then step aside," he said. "We will take what we need and leave what we leave. Nobody has to come to harm over water." She looked past him at the faces in the torchlight. She picked out the ones she needed to reach not Silas. She had no interest in reaching Silas, but the people behind him who were not entirely gone yet. The Hadley family from the south end of town, decent people in a bad position. The widow Marsh, who had 3 children and almost no resources. Old Carl Fenner, who had farmed the ridge country for 40 years and knew land the way she knew it, and would understand if she could make him hear her what destroying the well would actually cost. "I am not going to step aside," she said. Her voice was even and clear and carried without effort in the still air. "I am going to make you a proposal, and I am going to ask every person here to listen to it before anyone does anything that cannot be undone." "You are in no position to make proposals," Silas said. "Silas," she said, and used his name with the flat, unintimidated directness of someone who has ceased to be afraid of a thing. "You have not been in a position to tell me what position I am in since October. You know that. Everyone here knows that. So let us all stop pretending otherwise and talk about what actually matters tonight, which is the survival of every family in this county through the end of summer." A silence moved through the group, not agreement exactly, but the specific quiet of people who have been spoken to honestly and are recalibrating. She did not let it fill. She kept going because momentum in a crowd was everything, and she understood this the way she understood irrigation: keep it moving or it stagnates. "My husband and I have a working well and a full cistern," she said. "We built them through the winter and spring on our own, with our own labor and our own resources. We built them correctly, which is why they have water when nothing else does. That water belongs to us." She paused. "I am prepared to ration 2 pails per family per day for every family in Dustfall Ridge through the end of the drought. That is my proposal. Not because anyone here has a right to what we built, but because there are children in this town, and I am not willing to watch children suffer when I have the means to prevent it." The silence that followed this was different from the first one. She heard it shift, felt the quality of the crowd change in the subtle physical way that crowds change when the narrative they arrived with begins to lose its structural integrity. Silas heard it too, and it made him worse. "Pretty words," he said, his voice dropping into the register. She knew the one he used when he had decided to be very unpleasant, "from a woman who stole from me and hid behind a man's name. You think this county is going to take charity from you? Stand aside or we burn the cabin and take the well anyway." And there it was. The thing she had known was underneath all of it, the threat that was always going to arrive here regardless of what was said before it, because Silas Jebb had never been capable of accepting a version of events in which Harriet Lou Dawson was something other than something he owned. She did not flinch. She had prepared for this specific moment with the same methodical care she had given every other problem on this property, and she moved now with the calm of someone executing a plan they have rehearsed completely. She stepped off the porch. She walked to the side of the cabin, and she picked up what was resting against the wall there, what she had placed there 3 hours ago against this precise moment. She walked back to the center of the yard, and she stood in the torchlight, where every person present could see her clearly, and in one hand she held a bundle of mining dynamite, 3 sticks bound with wire that she had purchased 6 weeks earlier from a mining supply in the county seat for exactly this contingency. In her other hand she held a box of matches. She struck a match. The sound of it was very small in the large silence of the yard. The flame was very bright in the dark. She did not move toward the well. She simply stood where she was in the center of the yard, equidistant from the crowd and the cabin, with the lit match in one hand and the dynamite in the other, and she let the image fully assemble itself in every watching mind before she spoke. "If one more person takes one more step," she said, and her voice was the same voice she had used in the cold November cabin to pull Ethan back from wherever he had been, the voice that had no panic in it and no appeal, and nothing but the absolute factual weight of a person who means exactly what they are saying. "I will walk to that well, and I will drop this bundle down the shaft, and I will blow it to rubble 30 feet underground. And every drop of water on this property will be locked under collapsed rock for the next 10 years. Not a person moved. The torches burned. The match burned. "You can kill us," she said. "That is true. You outnumber us, and some of you are armed, and that is a fact I am not disputing. But before you do understand what you are buying with it. If we die, the water dies with us, because there is not one person in that group who has the knowledge to manage this well and this cistern through a long drought. Not one." She looked at old Carl Fenner when she said this, because he was the one most likely to know it was true, and she saw him close his eyes briefly in the acknowledgement of it. "You came here tonight for water. Kill us, and you guarantee you never see another drop from this land. Or," she paused, "you get off my property. Every one of you. And tomorrow morning you come back in daylight with your buckets, and I will be standing at that well, and I will give 2 pails to every family here, and I will do it every day this drought lasts." She let the match burn down close to her fingers. Then she blew it out. The gesture was not theatrical. It was practical, because she did not need the match anymore, and burning her fingers served no purpose. But its effect on the watching crowd was considerable, because it communicated without a word that she was entirely in control of herself and entirely serious about every word she had said. Silas Jebb took 1 step forward. The cabin door opened. Ethan stepped onto the porch with the Winchester in his hands, not raised, not threatening, simply present the way Ethan was present in everything, with the complete grounded solidity of a man who has decided where he stands and is not interested in negotiating it. He looked at Silas from the porch, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that Harriet had not already said better. Silas looked at Ethan. He looked at Harriet. He looked at the dynamite in her hand, and the spent match and the absolute steadiness of her expression in the torchlight, and something moved through his face that she had never seen there before in all the years she had known him. It was not respect. It was something more primitive than respect. It was the recognition of a force that he could not overcome, and the understanding arriving fully formed and impossible to argue with that the version of this night he had imagined on the walk out from town was not the version he was standing in. He looked back at the crowd behind him. The crowd was already moving. Not dramatically, not in a rush, but with the quiet, deflating movement of people who have come a long way on a conviction and arrived to find it did not hold the weight they had put on it. The Hadley family turned first. Then the widow Marsh, holding her youngest child against her hip, met Harriet's eyes for one moment with an expression that contained several things at once: relief, shame, and something that would later become gratitude. Old Carl Fenner looked at the ground and then looked up at Harriet and gave a single slow nod, the kind that one person gives another when they are acknowledging that the right call was made, and then he turned and went with the rest. Silas stood in the emptying yard for a long moment. He was the last one, and in that position he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people around him and everything to do with what had just been demonstrated about the limits of his authority. He looked at Harriet one more time, and she looked back at him, and between them passed the complete and final accounting of 11 years, all the labor and the silence and the cold barn room and the muddy street and the ledger and the morning at the notary's office and every fence and trench and well shaft and stone wall and irrigated garden bed between that morning and this one. He turned and walked into the dark. She waited until the sound of the last horse and the last boot had faded down the road. Then she lowered her arms and set the dynamite carefully on the ground and stood in the quiet yard and breathed. Ethan came down from the porch. He stood beside her and looked out at the dark road and the torches retreating in the distance. "You blew out the match," he said. "I did not need it any more," she said. "You were never going to drop it down the well," he said. It was not quite a question. She was quiet for a moment. "I built that well," she said. "Foot by foot, bucket by bucket, 6 feet of bedrock at a time." She paused. "No, I was not going to destroy it." She looked at him, but they did not know that. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and then he did something she had not expected. He laughed. Not loudly and not long, but genuinely from somewhere real. The laugh of a man who has been surprised by the world in a way that pleases him deeply, and the sound of it in the dry July air was one of the finest things Harriet had ever heard. Then the first drop of rain fell on her upturned face. She did not move for a moment, not certain she had felt what she thought she felt. Then another. Then 3 more, hitting the dry dust of the yard with small, dark dots that disappeared almost as soon as they appeared. And then a sound began in the distance, a sound she had not heard in so long that it took her a moment to name it, the sound of rain advancing across dry land, the soft collective percussion of water finding the earth. Then it came. Not gently, not tentatively. The way things come when they have been held back too long with a totality that is somewhere between relief and violence. Sheets of water driving down out of a sky that had finally at the absolute limit of endurance given way. The yard turned to mud in minutes. The rock face of the ridge above them ran with water in a dozen places. The cistern filled to its brim and overflowed, and the overflow ran down the drainage channel in a clear, rushing stream toward the basin and the garden and the dark soil that had been waiting for it through the longest summer in memory. They stood in it. Neither of them moved for cover. The rain soaked through her work clothes and plastered her hair to her face and ran down the back of her neck, and she stood in it with her face turned up and her eyes closed and let it happen, because some things deserve to be felt completely. She felt his hands first, both of them finding her shoulders in the dark and the rain, and then he turned her toward him and she went, because it was the right direction, and he pulled her in and held her with the kind of grip that has nothing tentative in it, the grip of a man who has decided and is not revisiting the decision. She pressed her face against his shoulder and held on. The rain came down around them, and the cistern ran over, and the garden drank, and the well stood deep and full beneath the bedrock. And in the basin the dark soil absorbed the water with the patient bottomless appetite of ground that has been properly prepared. And the night smelled of wet rock and wet earth, and the particular clean freshness that only comes when a long-denied thing is finally given what it needs. He set it into her wet hair without ceremony and without hesitation, the same way he said, "Everything true. You are the most beautiful thing this world ever gave me." She did not answer right away. She had spent so many years with those words or the absence of them, the long accumulating silence where they might have been years of believing herself unworthy of them by virtue of her size and her roughness and her scars and the blunt, formidable, undelicate fact of what she was. She felt the old ache in her chest, the familiar low wound of it. And then she felt something else, the thing that had been cracking along its fault line since December, since his hands around hers at the table, since every morning of honest labor, and every evening of shared silence, and every moment of trust, freely given and freely received. It finished breaking open. She tightened her arms around him. "I believe you," she said. These were the 3 most difficult words she had ever spoken, not because she doubted him, but because believing required her to release something she had been holding for a very long time, the armor of a person who has decided that certain things are simply not available to them, and the letting go of armor is always harder than the putting on of it. But she let it go. And the rain came down. They were still standing in the yard when the thunder found them rolling across the ridge in long reverberations that shook the air pleasantly. And Harriet laughed, which was a sound that surprised even herself, low and real and unguarded. And Ethan held her tighter when he heard it, as if it were something he intended to keep. Tomorrow there would be families arriving with their buckets, and she would stand at the well, and she would give them their 2 pails each. Every family, including the widow Marsh's children and the Hadley family, and old Carl Fenner, because she had said she would, and because children did not choose their circumstances, and because the woman she was now was not a woman who withheld water from the thirsty out of pride. Tomorrow there would be the long work of the community repair that would follow from this night, the complicated business of people who had come as a mob being received as neighbors, which would require more grace than most of them deserved, and which she intended to give anyway, because it was practical and because grace, she had learned this from Ethan, and from the Mustangs, and from the deep well, and the dark soil, and everything. The last months had taught her grace was not weakness. It was the most demanding form of strength there was. And there would be the ongoing work of the ranch itself, the cattle and the horses and the garden and the channels and the soil that needed building, and the fences that always needed something, and the seasons ahead with their own uncertainties. There would be the continuing education of 2 people in the lifelong subject of each other, the patient, daily, imperfect, essential work of that. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the rain fell on the Maddox property and filled everything that had been empty and softened everything that had gone hard with drought, and 2 people who had arrived at each other through desperation and pragmatism and a stolen ledger and a November night terror and a dead spring seep and 23 torches in the dark, stood in the middle of it, and held on, and the water ran down the drainage channels into the basin, and the garden grew, and the well stood deep and certain below the bedrock, and the ridge above them ran with a dozen clear streams, and the whole dark land smelled of the oldest promise. There is the one that says that what has been dry will not always be dry. And what has been broken can be made into something that the breaking was necessary for something stronger at the fractured places than it ever was before. Years later, if you came to Dustfall Ridge in the green season, you would find a ranch on the south edge of town that did not look like the same ground it was planted on because ground changes with the quality of attention given to it and the stubbornness of the hands that work it. There were cattle in good condition on the range and horses in the corral, and a kitchen garden in the basin below the ridge that people from 3 counties came to see, not as a spectacle, but as an example, as evidence of what thin and rocky soil will do when someone reads it right and refuses to give up on it. The woman who ran that ranch was broad-shouldered and formidably built, and moved with the unhurried ground-level authority of someone who has made a complete and irrevocable peace with exactly who they are. She had strong hands and a square jaw, and dark eyes that took in everything, and gave back these days considerably more than they once had. She did not smile easily, but when she did, it was the real thing, the kind that changes a face entirely and makes everyone in the vicinity feel that something has been settled. The man beside her was lean through the jaw and broad through the shoulders, and had eyes the color of clear water. He did not crowd her, and she did not crowd him, and between them was the ease of people who have chosen each other so many times and in so many circumstances that the choosing has become the ground beneath their feet, invisible and indispensable. They were not a perfect love story. They were something better than that. They were a true one, built from necessity and stubbornness and the willingness to show up in the dark for each other without any guarantee of what the morning would bring. Built from a stolen ledger and a marriage of convenience and a November axe and a dynamite bluff in the rain. Built from 2 people who arrived at each other with every wall in place and discovered through the sustained pressure of honest daily life together that walls are not the strongest structure, that the strongest thing is the thing that is built with both hands open, shaped by what the land actually offers rather than what you wished it would, rooted deep enough to survive whatever the sky decides to withhold. Dustfall Ridge was still a hard place. The land was still the land, unforgiving of carelessness and indifferent to sentiment. But the Maddox Ranch sat on it like a declaration green and deliberate and permanent, a thing that 2 scarred people had pulled out of bedrock through sheer force of will and the willingness to believe, when belief was the most difficult and most necessary thing in each other, which was in the end the only miracle the story required.